On a cold November night in 1987, Mark Wilson sat alone in his new home in a small town called Riverwood, Maine. The house, an old structure from the early 20th century, stood on the outskirts of town, far from neighbors and any signs of life. Mark, a writer by profession, had sought a quiet place to finish his new novel and believed this house would be perfect. Outside, rain poured heavily, and the wind howled through the trees surrounding the property. Mark sat in the living room, reading a book by the light of a table lamp, embraced by solitude. Suddenly, he heard a strange sound coming from upstairs. A slow, heavy tread moving directly above him. Mark tried to convince himself it was just the creaking of old wood in the cold or perhaps the wind. Still, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling creeping into his heart. The sound came again, this time louder and more distinct. Setting his book aside, he stood, opened a drawer, and retrieved a small flashlight. Standing at the bottom of the staircase, he called out cautiously, "Is anyone there?" No response came. He ascended the stairs slowly, his steps hesitant, feeling as though the shadows around him were growing darker. When he reached the upper floor, he checked each room. Everything appeared normal. The windows were securely shut, and a thin layer of dust covered the furniture, indicating these rooms hadn't been used in a long time. But at the end of the hallway, Mark noticed something he hadn't before. A small door in the ceiling. The door was barely visible, its edges blending with the old paint. It seemed to lead to an attic he hadn't known existed. Hesitating briefly, Mark pushed the door open, revealing an old wooden ladder leading upwards. He climbed cautiously, mindful of the creaking steps. The attic was dark, but when Mark shone his flashlight, he saw an odd scene. The space was filled with old boxes, dusty books, and cobwebs covering everything. In the center of the room stood a worn wooden chair, positioned in an eerie way as if waiting for someone to sit on it. Mark approached the chair and noticed a small leather-bound journal lying on the floor beside it. When he opened it, he found it contained the diary of someone who had lived in the house decades ago. The first entries were filled with mundane daily details, but they grew increasingly strange as he read on. On the last page, written in trembling handwriting, was a chilling note. "If you're reading this now, beware. The attic is not what it seems." A sudden chill swept through the attic, and the air seemed heavier. As Mark turned to leave, he heard a faint whisper behind him. "You are not alone." Mark quickly returned downstairs, feeling as if something was chasing him. He shut the attic door behind him, making sure it was securely closed. He sat in the living room trying to calm his nerves. In his hand was the leather notebook, which had now become the focal point of his attention and fear. Mark began reading more of the journal. The owner of the notebook was named Jonathan King, and according to what he had written, he had lived in the house 50 years ago. Jonathan described strange occurrences, like footsteps heard at night, doors opening and closing by themselves, and shadows appearing in the corners of the house. But the strangest part was his description of the attic. Jonathan wrote, "There's something in the attic, something not from this world. Sometimes, I feel it watching me from the shadows. I tried to ignore it, but the more I tried, the bolder it became. One night, I saw its face. A face with no features, except for dark eyes that glowed in the dark." As Mark read, the lights in the house suddenly dimmed. Then they went out completely, leaving the house plunged in darkness. He tried to turn on the flashlight, but it started flickering erratically. Suddenly, he heard footsteps coming from the attic, even though he had made sure the door was tightly shut. Mark stood frozen, torn between going upstairs to investigate or fleeing the house. But he realized that the front door was locked, and the key was in his pocket. He decided to face his fear and climbed the stairs again, determined to uncover what was happening. When he reached the attic, he found the door open. The air was unnaturally cold, and the intense chill seeped into his bones. He slowly stepped inside, holding the flashlight that barely illuminated the space. The attic appeared the same as it had before, but the chair in the center was not empty this time. There was someone sitting in it. The darkness concealed their features, but it seemed as though they were watching Mark. Mark spoke in a trembling voice. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure did not move, but slowly raised a hand and pointed at the notebook Mark was holding. A hoarse, terrifying voice emanated from nowhere. "You opened it. Now I won't leave." In that instant, Mark rushed toward the stairs, trying to escape. But before he could reach the bottom, he heard a deep laugh echoing throughout the house. When he turned, he saw the shadow moving quickly toward him. He reached the living room and slammed the door behind him. The sound of footsteps and laughter grew louder and closer. The entire house seemed to pulse with fear. Mark tried to open the front door, but found it stuck, as if an invisible force was preventing him from leaving. Suddenly, the notebook in his hand began to shake. He opened it quickly and saw that the pages were blank, except for one sentence that appeared in large, clear letters. "You won't be able to escape. You're part of the story now." Mark felt as though the entire house was closing in on him, as if the walls themselves were whispering words he couldn't comprehend. Shortness of breath overwhelmed him, and his legs barely moved as he trudged toward the kitchen, hoping to find a window to escape. But when he reached it, he discovered it was firmly shut. The glass fogged up from the inside despite the cold air outside. At that moment, the dim light from the lantern he carried illuminated new words on the pages of the notebook he had clung to all along. The words appeared gradually, as if an unseen hand was writing them before his eyes. "You cannot escape unless you face it." Mark hesitated for a moment, but he realized he had no choice. He had to confront whatever was happening, or the house would consume him entirely. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen table and began walking reluctantly toward the stairs leading to the attic. The closer he got to the attic, the louder the noises became. Screams, crying, whispers, and the sound of something pounding inside the walls. When he reached the door, he pushed it open slowly, finding it already ajar. The air was so dense that breathing became difficult. Inside the attic, the chair was in its usual place, but this time, shadows swirled around it in a dark, circular motion, like a vortex. At the center of the vortex was the same mysterious figure he had seen before. It raised its head toward Mark, and its glowing black eyes pierced his soul. "What do you want from me?" Mark shouted in desperation. The same raspy voice replied, but this time it was clear. "You always open the door. You are not the first, but you will be the last." Mark knew he had to end this nightmare. Holding the notebook in one hand and the knife in the other, he forced himself to move closer to the chair at the center of the swirling shadows. The closer he got, the heavier the air became, and the shadows seemed to push him back. But Mark was determined to finish what had begun. When he reached the chair, he raised the knife high and plunged it into the heart of the decaying wooden chair. A deafening scream filled the attic, a sound of agony that seemed to come from hundreds of trapped souls. The shadows began to dissipate, and the mysterious figure dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind a heavy emptiness. Suddenly, the house fell silent. The attic was now completely empty, as if it had never contained anything sinister. Exhausted and stunned, Mark descended the stairs and left the house for the first time since the nightmare began. Standing outside, he looked back at the house and felt that something had changed. It was eerily quiet, and the windows reflected the dark sky without any trace of the horrors he had endured. Mark never returned to the house. A few days later, he sold it for the lowest price he could and left the town for good. But to this day, there was one thing he could not get rid of: the leather-bound notebook that remained with him no matter how many times he tried to discard it. Each time he attempted to throw it away or burn it, it mysteriously returned to its place. And every time he opened it, a new page would appear, bearing a cryptic message, as though the story was far from over. In the suburbs of the small town of Shining Hills in Northern California, Daniel Crawford purchased an old house dating back to the 1930s. The house was spacious, surrounded by towering oak trees, and perched atop a hill overlooking a deep valley. For Daniel, a graphic designer seeking solitude to begin his personal project, the house seemed like a dream come true. Despite the house's charm, It was clear that it carried a peculiar aura. The walls were painted in faded colors, and the wooden ceiling showed signs of age. The neighbors he met when signing the purchase agreement were cryptic in their comments about the house, offering brief remarks like, "It's very old, but it's beautiful," or "No one stayed there for long." On his first day in the house, Daniel spent hours unpacking and exploring the rooms. The ground floor featured a spacious living room, a vintage kitchen, and a dining room filled with old paintings depicting an unknown family from the 1940s. The second floor had 3 bedrooms, but what intrigued him the most was the basement. The basement door was at the end of the hallway behind the kitchen, covered in a thick layer of dust, suggesting it hadn't been opened in many years. Out of curiosity, Daniel tried to open it, but it was locked tightly, and the key was missing. Deciding to postpone the matter, Daniel focused on completing his unpacking. As the sun set, the house took on a quiet, eerie atmosphere. The wind rustled through the trees, creating whisper-like sounds, and the wooden floorboards creaked with every step. That night, Daniel sat on the couch in the living room, soaking in the ambience while listening to soft music and trying to relax. Suddenly, the electricity went out, plunging the house into darkness. Grabbing a flashlight, Daniel checked the electrical panel in the kitchen, but everything appeared to be in working order. When he returned to the living room, he noticed the windows were open, even though he was certain he had closed them. A cold wind blew in, sending a chill down his spine. He shut the windows and returned to the couch. But before he could sit down, he heard a faint sound coming from upstairs. It sounded like slow, heavy footsteps. Frozen in place, Daniel tried to make sense of what he had heard, convincing himself it might be the wind reacting with the old house. The sound came again, clearer this time, footsteps moving slowly across the upstairs floor. Holding his flashlight tightly, Daniel climbed the stairs hesitantly. Once upstairs, he checked each room, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The rooms were empty, and the windows were securely closed. As he turned to leave the upper floor, something caught his eye at the end of the hallway. There was a small wooden door in the ceiling that he hadn't noticed before. When he tried to open it, he discovered it led to the attic. Daniel climbed into the attic, which was dark and filled with dust. Moving cautiously among old boxes and discarded furniture, his attention was drawn to a small wooden box placed carefully in the corner. Opening the box, he found an old leather journal inside. As he flipped through the pages, he realized it belonged to someone named Richard Black, who had lived in the house during the 1940s. The journal seemed ordinary at first but became increasingly strange toward the end. Richard had written, "The house isn't what it seems. There's something living below, something ancient and dangerous. The basement must always remain locked. I have the key, and I won't let anyone open that door." A chill ran through Daniel as he read the words. Determined to leave the attic, he turned to descend, but before he could, he heard a faint voice behind him whisper, "The key must be returned." After hearing the sound in the attic, Daniel quickly ran downstairs, trying to convince himself that what had happened might just be a hallucination from exhaustion. He sat on the couch, attempting to calm himself, but he couldn't shake the heavy feeling left by the leather-bound journal and the last note he read about the basement. He spent the night trying to sleep, but kept waking up to strange noises. Heavy footsteps in the hallways, faint moans as if coming from underground, and intermittent whispers emanating from the direction of the basement. The more he tried to ignore them, the louder and clearer they became, as though something was deliberately trying to grab his attention. With the break of dawn, Daniel decided he needed to uncover the secret of the locked basement. He began searching the house for the key mentioned in the journal but couldn't find it. This led him back to the attic, where he had found the leather box. He examined the box again and this time noticed a small piece of cloth tightly wrapped beneath the journals. Unfolding it, he found the rusty key he had been searching for. Daniel stood in front of the basement door, the key in his hand feeling unnaturally heavy, as if silently warning him. After a moment of hesitation, he inserted the key into the lock and heard a deep metallic click as the door creaked open. The basement was pitch dark, and the air emanating from it was unnaturally cold. Grabbing a flashlight, he descended the stone steps cautiously. The walls were damp, and the smell of mold permeated the air. The basement was unexpectedly large, stretching deeper than he had imagined. As he moved further in, he began noticing strange things. Symbols carved into the walls, shelves filled with old, cryptic books, and in one corner, a wooden table bearing burnt candles and metal bowls containing remnants of peculiar substances. The space appeared to have been used for some kind of ritual. What caught his attention the most was another door at the far end of the basement. It was made of dark wood and adorned with intricate, otherworldly carvings. The door looked as though it belonged to an entirely different era and was sealed with a massive metal lock. As Daniel approached the door, an intense chill coursed through his body, and the air around him seemed to grow heavier. When he touched the lock, he heard a whispered voice say, "Do not open the door. He must not be released." Terrified, Daniel recoiled, trembling at the sound. But the pull of curiosity drew him back. He tried to open the lock but didn't have the right key. At that moment, he felt as though something was watching him from the shadows. He decided to return upstairs, but when he turned toward the staircase, he noticed that the basement door above was now closed, though he had left it open. The footsteps he had heard during the night were now echoing inside the basement itself, slowly approaching him. Panicking, Daniel ran toward the door and began pounding on it with all his strength, desperately trying to open it. Suddenly, his flashlight went out, plunging him into complete darkness. In the blackness, he felt something touch his shoulder. The touch was cold and dry, like a skeletal hand reaching out from nowhere. A low, deep voice resonated in the basement. "You have opened the path. Now it will not stop." In the next instant, the basement door above burst open. Daniel scrambled out, gasping for breath, and slammed the door shut behind him. But as he turned toward the room, he saw that the symbols carved into the basement walls had begun to appear throughout the house, as if something had followed him from below. After escaping the basement, Daniel stood in the kitchen, his body trembling and his heart racing uncontrollably. He tried to calm himself and convince himself that everything that had happened was just an illusion. But the symbols beginning to appear on the walls of the house were enough to prove that something real was happening. The room grew colder, as if the air was being sucked out of it. Suddenly, all the lights went out, and a thick darkness engulfed everything. Daniel tried turning the lights back on, but the electricity was gone. At that moment, he began to hear scattered noises coming from all over the house. Whispers, moans, and footsteps echoing through every hallway. A deep, ominous voice spoke from nearby. "You are the one who opened the door. Now you will face the consequences." Daniel rushed into the living room, clutching a flashlight, but he quickly realized that the darkness in the house had grown so dense that the light barely penetrated it. The wooden floor beneath his feet began to tremble, as if something under the house was trying to rise. He remembered the journal he had found in the attic, which mentioned that the basement contained something ancient and dangerous. He sprinted to the attic and retrieved the journal, searching desperately for any hint or method to stop what was happening. In the final pages, he found a passage written in a shaky hand. "If it is released, the only way to return it is to confront it directly in the basement and seal the door with the sacred stone I left there." Digging through the attic, Daniel found a small pouch containing a smooth stone inscribed with a strange symbol. He grasped it carefully and headed back to the basement, even though every fiber of his being screamed at him not to. When he opened the basement door, a powerful gust of icy wind pushed him back a step. He descended the stairs slowly, and when he reached the dark wooden door at the basement's end, it was wide open this time. Beyond it lay a deep pit, from which thick shadows emerged, writhing like a living entity. From within the shadows, a massive figure emerged, its body grotesque and its features indistinct. Its glowing red eyes pierced through the darkness, and its voice boomed like thunder. "You should not have come near. Now you will become part of me." Fear gripped Daniel, but he remembered the stone in his hand. He began to recite the words written alongside the passage in the journal, though he didn't understand their meaning. As he spoke, the shadows began to retreat, and the figure writhed as if in agony. Summoning courage he didn't know he had, Daniel stepped closer to the pit and hurled the stone into it. The moment the stone hit the bottom, a deafening scream echoed through the house, shaking it to its core. The shadows vanished, the figure dissolved, and the pit closed gradually. Exhausted and terrified, Daniel climbed out of the basement and locked the door behind him. He took the journal and the remaining sacred stone and buried them far away from the house, then left the property for good. In the following weeks, he sold the house to a real estate development company but never told them what had transpired inside. To this day, Daniel still wonders about the entity in the basement and what might have happened had he not stopped it in time. As for the house, it remained empty for years, shrouded in an eerie silence, as if something within still watched, waiting for someone to make the same mistake again.